How's it going, Jordan? What's up?
Rob, it's going well. How
Good.
are you?
I'm all right. R.I.P. Tina Turner. Sad news. One of the absolute best to ever do it.
Yeah. What a performer.
Yeah. She's simply the best as a performer and also as just a really good Tina Turner song. But you know who's not simply the best? Ron DeSantis and Elon Musk.
Okay. Wow.
I've spent all day workshopping that. I got a team. I went on Fiverr and hired a team of writers to come up with that one.
Yeah.
So
you cross the picket line. You cross the picket line is what you're saying, to hire non-union comedy writers, and that's the product
just
you
paying
get.
them pennies on the dollar.
You're right. Mm-hmm. Rob stands in solidarity with the big studios.
Exactly. Thank you. These uppity Hollywood writers, they've had it too good for too long. Okay. Got to make sure we support the massive corporate conglomerates and their shareholders. Aren't they who's really more important in this creative process? No, but we just moving on from this. We did get into the Elon Musk and Ron DeSantis Twitter space. Would you call that a fiasco or a debacle?
Ooh, I don't know. That's a tough characterization.
Yeah, it's a clusterfuck. Whatever you want to call it.
Say it's a disaster.
There we go.
Like a DeSantis disaster.
That's nice.
I got that joke on Fiverr as well.
Sick. We talked a little bit about that in our previous episode that came out earlier this week, where you also talked to Ben Smith. That was a good one.
Yeah, I did. Ben Smith, who founded Semaphore and was the former editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, joined me to talk about his new book, Traffic, which chronicles the rise and fall of digital media. And we've seen this landscape change throughout our lives, and I know throughout our listeners' lives. You remember when Gawker, Jezebel, and early BuzzFeed were dominating your Facebook pages, your Facebook feeds, your Twitter feeds, but Gawker, in its original iteration, is now dead. BuzzFeed News is shutting down. Jezebel's still there. But another mainstay, Vice, recently just filed for bankruptcy. We'll see what that looks like if it gets acquired by another media company. But things have definitely changed because so much of their model was based around traffic. This book chronicles that race from the start of these sites, how they originated, how they all knew each other. All the founders, for the most part, knew each other and hung out in a bar in New York as they started their own sites. It's a really, really fascinating read. We also got into talking about some of the people that spun out of BuzzFeed that worked for Ben, like Baked Alaska and Benny Johnson, and got his thoughts on their post-BuzzFeed careers, including for Baked Alaska, live streaming from the Capitol during January 6th. So it was a really interesting conversation with Ben. Go check that out, theinsurgents.substack.com. Just $5 a month. You get that episode and an additional episode every week. You get access to all of our premium episodes for our beloved paid interns.
We love the paid interns. Yes, we do. And yeah, as I was mentioning, we already did kind of go to riff central on the disastrous Twitter space thing. But I must say, though, that it is really funny how they're leaning into the whole, we broke the internet thing. They're trying to spin it as this big success because 300,000 concurrent listeners crashed the entire fucking system, and they're trying to pretend like it's this. People were just so excited. They're so ready to jump on the DeSantis train. They're just broke the whole thing, and they're putting out T-shirts now apparently about this. Genuinely, the stench of desperation off this campaign already in day one is palpable.
Saying we broke the internet about Twitter Spaces buckling under the weight of 300,000 users is such a funny choice, because to the internet savvy, they will recognize that's not really that big.
No.
Just to go back to my conversation with Ben, we talked about the Steele dossier, and when they published that, the traffic that they saw was colossal. And in another BuzzFeed story, you remember the dress. That was their biggest traffic day of all time. We're talking tens, if not hundreds of millions of views and shares on these pieces. That really is breaking the internet. Something like that is colossal. 300,000 concurrents on a live stream isn't even the biggest of the past year. But so the internet savvy will recognize how ludicrous of a framing that is. And then the ones who won't, the senior citizens, the boomers who make up a large share of the Republican electorate, they're not going to know what the fuck you're talking about.
No. And, you could have just done your campaign announcement on like talk radio, which goes out to way more people than 300,000 and, is a technology that has been working pretty well for a really long time. It's not like this is this new thing. The idea of transmitting audio, it's like magic, transmitting audio to hundreds of thousands of people at once. It's just this amazing, miraculous technology. No, this is actually pretty old stuff. We've been able to do this for quite a while. I did also see just a few minutes ago as well that the FDA has approved the first human trial for Elon Musk's brain chip company, Neuralink. And yeah, given the exploding rockets and the exploding cars and the exploding social media website, I don't see a downside to people just signing up for that. Just let this guy implant shit right into your brain, right into your hypothalamus. I think that'd be a great idea, and I encourage all our blue check colleagues and friends to jump on board. Do you want to be first to try this new fantastic technology, or don't you? This is the time where you got to really step forward and step into the next generation. So I encourage everyone to sign up for the trials of that.
Yeah, and that's why we're proud to announce our partnership with Neuralink. And if you go to their site and use promo code Insurgent, you get 50% off your first implant. So again, promo code Insurgent over at Neuralink. We're proud to offer 50% off on your Elon Musk brain implant.
That's right. And now instead of actually listening to the podcast, you'll get like an intrusive thought, which is just me and Jordan like bullshitting, and you're in your brain, like literally
talking to you in your sleep.
That's right. Doesn't that sound wonderful? I know that sounds, people are going to be very excited about that. And we have to introduce our next guest coming up, Gaby and Felipe, who write the Borderlines Substack. They do really fantastic work covering border issues and immigration issues in America. They've both been guests on the show before separately, and it was really cool to be able to get both of them to come on. As I was saying, like during this conversation, I think like given we're getting into like election season in America, as hard to believe as that is, it's like kind of on the horizon, and there's going to be a whole bunch of talk about the most important election of everyone's lifetimes and drawing this contrast between the Biden administration and whatever Trump or DeSantis or whoever it is wants to do, and probably not DeSantis given how that's been going. But I think it's really important to focus on Biden's record when it comes to immigration, considering the ways that so many liberals were so adamant about holding Trump to account on this issue. And, they use this issue of the migrant crisis on the border and the deplorable state of where these migrants were staying and how horrendous it was, the family separation policy. They used that to attack Trump constantly. They used it to fundraise off of. And now that Biden has been continuing a lot of these policies, not all, but a lot of them, and there's still this crisis going on the border. There's still people dying on the border. I saw an 8-year-old Panamanian girl died in Border Patrol custody just this week. Like, this is still going on, but for a lot of liberals that made this their like main political issue during the Trump era, they don't seem really interested in exploring this or unpacking the ways that Biden has really failed on this and has perpetuated a lot of the same violence towards these extremely marginalized people, these migrants and asylum seekers. So I thought it was a really great opportunity to bring back Gaby and Felipe to talk about this. We had some like messed up technical difficulties that I think we tried to fix through the magic of technology and audio editing. I think it's going to be okay. Either way, though, it was a really fantastic conversation. I really appreciate the work that Gaby and Felipe do covering this issue, and I'm looking forward to having them back on the show.
Yeah, it was really great, and kudos to you for your editing, and we're proud to present AI Felipe.
That's right, yeah, exactly. And now that I'm an expert in that, not to get into my past trials and tribulations with that whole technology.
So we're trying to move on, but
Anyway, folks, I think you're really going to like it. It was a really fantastic conversation with Gaby and Felipe of the Borderlines Substack, which you should also subscribe to. And Gaby and Felipe will be joining the program right after this.
Rob, you got small talk here?
A little bit. I'm looking forward to tuning into the good old Jimmy Butler show this evening.
Me too. That's why I have to leave at 7:45.
Oh wow, is that why?
I thought it was like a work thing.
Yeah,
No.
I thought it was like a.
No,
Yeah.
I just am supposed to meet some people, and I texted them saying I'm going to be late.
I was gonna say I thought it was just like a serious thing, but it is
No,
serious. The
it's
NBA
not
playoffs.
serious.
So
That is serious.
yeah, no, it is.
I mean, it's a little
It's
serious,
deadly
but-
serious.
I mean, I, for one, believe that my God King Jimmy Butler will lead us to victory. So,
Yeah. Well, a big time
It's been
day
so
one
fun to
Miami
watch.
Heat fan here as well. So I agree with that. big fan from way back. I am
Oh,
all
yeah?
about Heat
You?
culture. Heat culture.
You know
as
they
I'm always telling
sell-
people about this.
they sell Big Face Coffee ice cream at Van Leeuwen. Like, he's really just an international businessman at this point.
Yeah.
He has been my favorite player to watch all postseason. Just the performances he's been putting on. I mean, rivaled by the first half of LeBron in Game 4 against the Nuggets. Like, that first half performance was unbelievable. 31 points, 100% from the free throw line and behind the 3-point line. He just put on a clinic. But Jimmy Butler has been on another level. I'm hoping for a Heat win tonight, so it's Heat Nuggets, and they both come in with equal amount of rest. But, oh my God, I would love to see the Heat win just because I'd love to see Jimmy Butler get a ring.
Yeah. It's been so entertaining watching him just like will them to victory. And that's the thing. It's like as watching the NBA playoffs without like an emotional stake, all I have is the pain of other sports fandoms. So that's really all I have to hold on to. So I've just been fully immersing myself in all the Celtics slander. The 76ers slander was very entertaining as well. I really enjoyed that. You know, that's all I have. That's all I have to hold on to. Just the misery of their fan bases, because I can say, "Ha ha, you know what it's like." So I've just been feeding off all that negativity.
I feel like I have some respect for the 76ers, but I have no respect for the city of Boston. And also I'm from Florida, so this is just really important for me.
Yeah,
Even though I did in the playoff, like my friend's playoffs pool, bet against the Heat like a traitor.
yeah,
Because I just didn't believe. And look what happened. The thing about basketball is that it's the sport with the most, not the most, but like the most entertaining lore. That's why I got into
Yeah.
it in the first place. There's just like all these beefs. There's all these people who don't like
Yeah.
each other. Sometimes people sleep with each other's wives. Like you don't get it like
Sure.
that in any other sport. It's crazy. No, that's what got me into the game when I really needed some gossip in my life.
yeah.
It's so important to me. And yet I'm a serious woman.
But Felipe and Gaby, we're so happy to have you here. Together, you write Borderlines, which is a great Substack about immigration policy. I think you both have been on the show before separately.
Yeah.
We're happy to have you both here with us to talk about some of the recent immigration policy news over the past couple of weeks, and unfortunately some of the immigration horror stories we've seen over the past couple of weeks. You two do a tremendous job synthesizing what is often very complicated policy maneuvers or rulemaking or changes to different federal guidelines, and you, through your writing, provide clarity for people who want to understand our immigration system. So we're happy to have you both here. Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen changes and ultimately an expiration of this Title 42 program. Now, I'm wondering if both of you, we've talked about Title 42 in the program before, but Felipe, before we were recording, you and I were both talking about how a lot of people hear that term and don't know what it is. So could both of you explain for listeners, give them a refresher, what Title 42 is and why it's in the news right now?
So Title 42 is actually a public health title. It's one of the titles of the United States Code, federal law. And it actually deals with basically a bunch of different sort of health and public health matters. In fact, a lot of people don't realize, for example, the mask mandates that we had under COVID were issued also under Title 42. So like when the masks on the airplanes, when that litigation was ongoing, that was under Title 42. So this particular section of Title 42 that's at issue here is 265. It's a sort of a provision of the law that has existed in some form or another, in some versions, since sort of the late 19th century. So it's been over 100 years. And basically what it says is in broad strokes, that the government has the ability to prohibit the entry of certain people or goods from certain countries where there's a high risk of introduction of a communicable disease to the United States, right? So it's not an immigration measure, right? It's not actually, it doesn't say anything about immigration. It doesn't mention immigrants, nor does it say anything about expulsions or asylum or anything like that. But during the sort of early pandemic, March 2020, the Trump administration invoked this part of the law to create basically the most restrictive border policy ever, until that point, and until any point actually in U.S. history, in the sense that it made it so that people who would otherwise be able to seek asylum, begin the process of applying for asylum, were denied the ability to even tender that application, and were instead often referred for immediate expulsion without further process. So they didn't go before a judge. They didn't go through any of the kind of other steps that are supposed to happen, when somebody kind of shows up at the border and asks for asylum. And, I think it's important to note too, like this wasn't something that kind of came out of the blue. In fact, Stephen Miller, the kind of architect of the Trump era, immigration restrictionism policies, had reportedly even wanted to invoke Title 42 before COVID, with like measles and some other things, because he saw it as a very powerful tool to shut down humanitarian migration. And then COVID kind of was the perfect excuse. And so for 3 years, up until May 11th was a couple of weeks ago, was kind of the final day that the policy was in place. But for 3 years, it was in place. It had kind of shifting restrictions. So a federal judge at one point said that it couldn't apply to unaccompanied minors, and there were certain exceptions and such. But for 3 years, it was used to conduct, millions of expulsions at the border of people who would otherwise have been able to access the asylum system. And so that's kind of, what ended recently, but, has been replaced at this stage with kind of other policies that the Biden administration put into place to kind of mimic or sort of have a similar set of restrictions. So it's not like we're back to normal processing now. It's just kind of a different paradigm.
Yeah, it's been around since, some version of this has been around since at least for sure, like 1907. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is, let me start over. Let me just start fresh. We're gonna like chop this whole thing up, right? Like it's not gonna be a straight, great,
fix
awesome.
it in post.
Great. So in practice, Title 42 did basically allow for CBP to almost immediately turn people away. You could cross the border, get processed, by which it was just like they'd kind of like take you in and then spit you back out across the border. And that was kind of under the best circumstances, is that you would be sent back immediately where you crossed. Under worse circumstances, CBP would in some instances detain people for days or up to weeks, and then send you to a different part of the border, and then expel you there in what was called like a lateral expulsion, which is an offshoot of lateral deportations, which are basically like designed to prevent people from attempting similar like routes if they're crossing between ports of entry, from hiring the same smugglers, from relying on this like same kind of networks that they were relying on to get into the United States. But that can be really dangerous for people, especially for people who paid for smugglers, because if you paid for someone, say, in Tijuana, and then you were sent back through Texas, those two different routes aren't controlled by the same smugglers. And increasingly, smugglers are tied to cartels just because of the entire kind of situation in northern Mexico right now, which means that people who were expelled, especially people who were expelled laterally, were put in really, really significant danger a lot of the time. I actually just interviewed somebody yesterday for a story I'm working on who was expelled 3 times under Title 42 with his family. And each time they were expelled to a different port of entry. They were like taken into CBP custody, put on a plane, flown across the border, and then like expelled into a completely different border patrol zone. And that was intentionally designed to discourage them from trying again. Another important distinction between expulsions and deportations is that deportations carry a bar on reentry, and they can only really happen in most circumstances, unless you're going through expedited removal, after you go through kind of a deportation hearing process. Expulsions are not a legal designation. It's not like a judge orders you expelled, you're just thrown back across the border. But this weird kind of perverse benefit came about where, because there was no legal record, there was no legal bar on reentry when you were expelled, you could just try over and over and over again. And if you knew that, you know, CBP or Border Patrol would find you, you would maybe be encouraged to try a more remote or more dangerous route to avoid them finding you. Whereas before Title 42 was put in place, people who were asking for asylum would they would just cross into the United States, and a lot of times would just sit there and wait. They would maybe even call 911 to have Border Patrol come pick them up, because their goal was to do it as quickly and easily as possible to avoid these dangerous routes, to like turn themselves in so that they could then ask for asylum.
You know, one of the things that I saw some coverage about recently, and one of the ways that migrants can claim asylum is with this CBP One app. And it's just, you both in Borderlines talked about how this is just another iteration of, you know, a technological solution to these types of problems. But it's been hamstrung by different issues, you know, tech issues. It's kind of wonky. Then I also saw earlier today, Ken Paxton in Texas is challenging the Biden administration over its use of this app. So could you explain for people what this is, how it's used or should be used if it works, and the legal challenges to this app?
So when CBP started requiring people to make appointments via this app, it was only available, I believe, in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. You could only access it if you had a smartphone, and there were just over 700 appointments every day. And there are tens of thousands of people all across the Mexican border who are waiting, trying to get appointments on this app. It was really, really glitchy. It's prone to crashes. And because there are so few appointments, people would all kind of log on at the same time, try to get appointments. The appointments would fill up pretty much immediately, and then they would have to just try again the next day. What's really, really interesting about the Republican reaction to this app is that they have described it as a concierge service for undocumented immigrants. They have said, you know, like they're rolling out the red carpet for them, like they're letting them just log on and say, I want to come to the United States, and then you can just come right in. Whereas in practice, this app is really, really restrictive and really limiting as to who can access it, both because of the need to have a smartphone that's connected to the internet, because of language barriers, and also just because of the limited number of appointments that are available. They recently increased it to 1,000 a day. And then you have to wait, you know, after you've secured your appointment for days or weeks to actually go to your appointment.
You know, one thing to note, right, is like CBP One, you know, the app itself actually existed before it started being used in this way. But, you know, it kind of like, I mean, people have even called it like Ticketmaster for asylum now, right? We've got to remember also, it's not like you can apply for asylum using CBP One. It only allows you to schedule an appointment to like begin the application that otherwise is supposed to be kind of just, you know, sort of available if you reach U.S. soil. And I think that it's kind of part of this kind of trend of like using technology to kind of, you know, make a show of sort of efficiency and sort of, you know, managed humanitarian pathways and sort of all these things that oftentimes are just kind of repainting sort of Trump era restrictionist policies, but kind of, adding this sort of veneer of like, oh, this is kind of a technological solution, this is efficiency, this is the future. Gaby had a great article in The Verge, last year that was about kind of also the virtual wall, and they have drones and sensors. There's even this company called Anduril, which is that little weirdo who did the Oculus, Palmer Luckey. He went on to found this also this kind of weird, Lord of the Rings obsessions with a lot of these cameraless strange folks, because Peter Thiel has Palantir and all this stuff. But anyway, I mean, it's all kind of like border security theater. And so CBP1, really what it does, and we've written about this in Borderline, is it kind of replicates actually a Trump era policy that was declared unlawful as well, called metering, where it used to be more ad hoc, where it's sort of just like border officials would say, oh, we're actually only taking X number of people today, we're only allowing X number of people to come in. And migrants even started keeping their own lists of like who was next to like be able to claim asylum and all these sorts of things. And so, CBP1, with its kind of the appointments, is just taking this kind of ad hoc policy that was declared unlawful and making it like a formal, tech-driven policy. But it's the same thing, right? It's kind of still kind of like part of this effort to shift also the kind of the new normal towards this more restrictionist approach.
I just wanted to add really quickly, this is veering a little bit away from Title 42, but a good comparison to how the Biden administration is kind of making this tech-based metering its new border management strategy is the way that it talks about the wall. When Biden was running for president, he was like, it's barbaric to have a wall. It's inhumane to have a wall. If I'm president, we won't have a wall. We'll have sensors and drones and all of these fancy high-tech solutions that are actually more effective than a wall. And people ate that up. And this is kind of the same thing. It's like this tech-based managed approach that is essentially the same as a Trump policy, like more expensive than metering, like even from like just a purely like logistical standpoint.
We're disrupting the concentration camp space.
No, exactly. And then there's also all this benefit of the doubt that they've been getting for years, where people will be like, oh, well, they're inheriting Trump's mess, so of course they have to fix it. It's going to take time. But he's been president for 2 years, and he had 2 years to figure out a way to get rid of Title 42 that didn't involve reinstating Trump policies.
The kind of consensus policy now is sort of this border restrictionism thing. And Biden, I think early on really took up the mantle of kind of we're going to reverse all of the the Trump era abuses, and we're going to do all this stuff. But for one part, I think he is terrified, and the administration is terrified of being branded kind of open borders. And obviously, this is something that's going to happen anyway, right? Which is something we've argued multiple times. I mean, I've joked that Joe Biden could be personally setting landmines all along the Rio Grande, and the rhetoric on the Republican side would be almost identical, because ultimately what these folks want is kind of full scale hermetically sealed borders, particularly to humanitarian migrants, whom they view as kind of having uniformly invalid claims. And the thing about kind of asylum is that from a very pure legal perspective, they might be right that a lot of these claims are technically meritless, in the sense that like it's actually a pretty narrow program, which is something also that people don't necessarily understand, right? The sort of the qualifying criteria involve persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, with the latter being kind of the most expansive. But it has to be persecution that's either state sponsored or enacted, or where the state sort of just is unable to kind of address it. It has to be for one of those approved reasons. It can't just be kind of a generalized danger. And so a lot of the people who are migrating are kind of in this weird in-between zone of like, yes, they might be living in dangerous environments, they might be at risk, but a lot of them don't sort of really strictly qualify for this kind of post-World War II definition that we've had, since that era, of kind of what it means to be an asylum seeker or refugee. And the kind of the bigger picture thing is that there's going to be this issue with, we're already having climate migration. So there's already a good number of people that are migrating because of the sort of the slow moving cataclysm of climate change. And there's also, it's also kind of inseparable to have that and sort of political persecution, because all these things end up mixing together, right? There's a drought that causes instability, that causes economic collapse, which causes political instability. So there's not these sort of really neat differentiations over kind of what is a climate impact and what isn't. But a lot of these people like probably wouldn't qualify for asylum. And so I think, to some degree, what's happening now is the administration and sort of just like the bipartisan consensus machine in Washington is drawing a line in the sand and saying, look, we were, before this really becomes, the kind of the wave of migration that we expect in this kind of climate, catastrophe future. And by the way, sort of migration patterns now are going to look like child's play compared to what we're going to be seeing in the next, 20, 30 years, sort of like drawing this status quo now of kind of a de facto, understanding of the claims as meritless, a de facto restrictionism, kind of pushing what we call border externalization. So coordinating with foreign militaries, foreign police forces, and sort of border agents to kind of push people back before they even reach the U.S. border, because there's also this kind of out of sight, out of mind thing, right? With the Remain in Mexico program, you saw people that were kind of even just across the border. I mean, literally 100 feet from the border, but there was far less public outrage because they weren't on U.S. soil. And so I think there's also kind of that strategy of like, having these interlocking parts that can kind of exclude people in a way that won't also engender kind of domestic political backlash.
I think it is really interesting to kind of explore the discrepancy between, number one, the way that conservatives talk about Democrats and Joe Biden's border policy versus the actual reality of it. Like you pointed out, this app is just opening the floodgates. I saw a tweet from Ben Shapiro the other day, because of Twitter's For You algorithm, I gets just served constant streams of right-wing content, which makes me understand. I didn't understand their views prior to that, and now I understand that these people are fucking monsters even more than I did before. But no, Ben Shapiro saying like, they're just like, Biden supports open borders. There's just no other way of looking at his immigration policies. Then that's the only conclusion you can come to. And it's really stunning when you actually compare that with the absolute ongoing horror show which was happening under Obama, which continued and escalated under Trump, and still, like you're pointing out, has not really been dealt with to this day. And not only noticing the discrepancy between the ways conservatives talk about this, but liberals as well, who, like, when Trump was president, they all wanted to talk about these barbaric immigration policies, and talk about these concentration camps, and talk about these families being torn apart, and the way that children are being abused, and all these horrific results of this kind of really barbaric, isolationist sort of immigration policy. And now that Team Blue is in charge, it seems like if they aren't just completely ignoring the issue entirely, or it's just suggesting like, well, we voted for the good guys, so the problem solved, and not paying any attention to it, or they're coming up with these kinds of excuses. They don't, it's Joe Manchin, it's Trump's crisis, there's nothing we can do. All of a sudden the president is just totally powerless. It is really amazing, I think, the way that like both liberals and conservatives have this totally distorted view of like what is happening at the border, and no one seems to really want to like address that in any way, or actually deal with these contradictions really meaningfully. You have conservatives that, like you're pointing out, just want to basically close the border to everyone, including people that are seeking asylum for these humanitarian reasons. Or we have liberals that are just like, now that they've got the electoral result they wanted, don't want to ever confront this issue or confront the horrible violence that people are still undergoing at the border. And I imagine as two people that cover that don't stop covering these issues depending on who's president, that's got to be very frustrating for you to notice that kind of discrepancy as well.
Title 42, for example, I mean, it's like one of these things where this went from like Stephen Miller's, greatest wet dream, like something that was, unachievable basically, and unprecedented completely several years ago, to being kind of the new consensus policy in Washington. And I feel like, people, politics is to some extent about aesthetics. I mean, we know that. And so, Biden is a person who, he's not out here, kind of inflaming tensions with, around immigration. He's not going, on on these big rallies and airplane hangars and saying that Mexicans are rapists and blah blah blah. And so it's kind of easier to assume that his policies are radically different. And to some extent, around immigration writ large, they are. For example, Biden is like rebuilding the refugee system to some extent, which was sort of decimated both by Trump and the pandemic. And there have been reforms to like work visas and stuff. Not anything super wholesale, but there have been shifts in the approach. However, on the sort of the border and humanitarian policy, it has been actually kind of a through line, right? He's been sort of set in place, but it's harder now, I think, to drum up kind of either support or even just kind of inform people about the sort of the through line that's happening, because a lot of people are closing ranks. And I remember very early on in Biden's presidency, kind of early 2021, I wrote this piece for the Washington Post that was about how day one he signed multiple executive orders that rolled back kind of Trump era policies. And it was very deliberately chosen as a day one thing. The cameras were there. It was sort of this whole fanfare. And I wrote this piece pointing out simply that, not really even making a very strong argument about it, but pointing out that a lot of these policies, there were so many redundancies in the kind of the Trump era restrictions that doing this didn't fundamentally change things that much, right? That there were still all these kind of overlapping policies that functionally made it so that these signings were more signaling than they were actually a shift, at that moment, a concrete shift. Especially there were these sort of pandemic era restrictions that blocked almost all immigration to the U.S. that have since expired, but at the time, right, remained active. And I have rarely gotten as much just kind of heat for a piece that I've written, and mainly from kind of like liberals and sort of people, moderate Democrats and sort of the Biden mold, who were telling me, how dare you? I guess you would rather just have Trump. I suppose that you don't care about migrants even, and that kind of thing. And I think the thing with kind of like the border, the Title 42, and sort of people like, for example, there was like a bill that was sponsored by Senators Kirsten Sinema, who big fan of the show, I'm sure, and Tom Tillis, who were basically trying to introduce legislation to extend Title 42 for 2 years before it was allowed to expire, along with the public health emergency. And that that legislation didn't even mention the actual Title 42, the law. It was like basically just like, we're maintaining these policies because we want to, no nexus to public health anymore. And what ended up happening was there was this fear that there would be like this huge wave of people in the aftermath of Title 42. And that's because there were a lot of people waiting because of these unprecedented restrictions. And so it became kind of like the self-fulfilling crisis. It was like a cyclical crisis. It was like we needed these crisis responses to the crises that the crisis responses were creating. And so, we had like Title 42, which was supposed to be an emergency order. And then because of the fear that the Title 42 bottleneck would cause this huge surge, then we needed to extend Title 42, and we needed to institute this new transit ban that's the current controlling policy at the border, because oh no, we created this bottleneck, and now we're going to face the consequences of it. So we actually need to increase the restrictions. And so, I think one thing that your listeners should try to kind of keep in mind and remember is like, really, when was the last time that any sort of national political figure of prominence talked about the border in a way that wasn't framed as a crisis, right? I mean, when was the last time we weren't on crisis footing? It's like kind of these like strong men who have the an emergency powers declaration that lasts 3 decades or something, like Muammar Gaddafi or something. It's like it just like has lost any nexus to whatever it even putative excuse existed in the first place to have these policies in place. And so we can never exit the crisis mode is kind of where we've ended up now. There's all the government has gotten used to this kind of these extraordinary powers, and it's not going to give them up. And so now we have this situation, which is kind of a rehash of a Trump era policy called the transit ban, where people are if they've transited through another country, that's a signatory of either the 1952 Refugee Convention or the 1967 Protocol, which a bunch of countries are, including Mexico. So if you've gone through Mexico and you are sort of a non-Mexican migrant and you arrive at the border, you are now presumptively ineligible for asylum. Like you have to overcome that presumption if you even want to apply for asylum, which you can only do if you either have applied for and been rejected already for asylum in like the other countries that you pass through, or you use the CBP-1 app, which again is like has 700 to 1,000 appointments per day, and is essentially trampling what was the spirit of asylum law, which is that anyone can just show up and they have to have a process, right? And so this new policy has essentially prevented the kind of surge that was predicted. And so we've actually seen border numbers go down in the aftermath of Title 42, which was the opposite of what was kind of predicted to happen. And the reason for that is these new policies. And so now you have, people like President Biden kind of saying mission accomplished, right? Like, oh, we were afraid of the surge. We put in these draconian policies. There was no surge. I'm expecting him to kind of unfurl a big mission accomplished banner, maybe at the border. I mean, or I'm like half kidding, but like this it's become so that the kind of the very policies that he once decried as sort of inhumane when they were under Trump are now kind of signature policies of his to say that he's actually he's a man of action, he's responding. And I think they're also getting a lot of cover from people like New York City Mayor Eric Adams, and people like DeSantis and Texas Governor Greg Abbott get often painted as kind of hapless idiots or whatever, and that's to some extent true. But I think they were very deliberate in some of these kind of busing stunts that were happening over the last year of kind of sending migrants without coordination to New York City and other places because they were sort of expecting people like Adams to eventually kind of like sour on sort of migration and kind of turn public opinion in kind of blue, big city, kind of blue enclaves away from migration. And I think it kind of worked, right? I mean, a lot of people here in New York are seeing kind of like, they hear every day from the media about the migrant crisis. They hear about how migrants are being put in hotels and school gyms. And, a lot of people are kind of have arrived at this kind of like rhetorical device of, oh, yes, I support migrants and I support humanitarian migration, but not like this. And so I think that was part of the strategy. And so kind of in tandem, we've reached a point where a chunk of Biden's domestic political constituency and Biden himself have sort of inched towards like kind of the embrace of the Trump era paradigm of restriction.
There is this profile that I read a while ago. It was by Jonathan Blitzer in the New Yorker of a Biden administration official who resigned, who was a young. I'm trying to remember if she was a lawyer. I know she was a policy person in some way. But she ended up resigning after all of her kind of work and her ideas were sidelined, even though she was the person who was responsible for the MPP wind down. MPP being the Remain in Mexico policy that required people to wait in Mexico while their cases were adjudicated by the U.S. courts or the U.S. immigration courts. And she was basically single-handedly in charge of like getting people who were on the MPP docket into the United States. It was like a couple dozen people each day paroled into the country. And she says in this profile that she'd worked in the Obama White House as well. And when the Senate and the House were trying to pass this DREAM Act bill, which kept failing because like a few senators kept voting against it time after time, there was this time when the Democrats agreed to increase funding for Border Patrol in exchange for protections for Dreamers. And she was really disappointed in Democrats for doing that. And then the Republicans were like, it doesn't matter what you give us because we're going to ask for more and we're going to keep accusing you of being open borders. And yet nobody who is high up in the Biden administration has seemed to realize that they can implement these Trump policies. They can be incredibly restrictive. And no matter what they do, they're going to be accused of opening the border. So a certain point you have to ask yourself, like, well, are they doing this because they feel like they've been painted into a corner? Or are they doing this because this is what they want?
Yeah, it's a great question.
On the subject of work authorization specifically, the reason why there are so many asylum seekers in New York right now who can't find housing and who are being housed in, old office buildings, or until a bunch of parents got all up in arms about it, school gyms, is that legally they're not permitted to work until they can't even apply for work permits until their asylum application has been pending for at least 150 days. And then USCIS, I think, has 30 days after that to respond minimum. So people are waiting for minimum 6 months so that they can even find jobs with which they can then pay rent and like be in this country while their cases are being processed. And that's not a Trump policy. That's not a Biden policy. That's like the long-standing law. So when we're looking at all of this, it's not just like the most recent president or the one before him implementing these policies to harm migrants. It's like the entire US immigration apparatus is designed in this way to weed people out, to exclude as many people as possible. And then, like, all of these attempts to change it, when people even do attempt to change it in ways that make it less restrictive, are met with incredible pushback from both Democrats and Republicans.
I'm reminded of in late 2017, when we were approaching a fiscal cliff, and Democrats were in the minority, but they had enough votes to block progress. Mitch McConnell, in exchange for support to pass a short-term funding bill, said, okay, well, we'll vote on DACA in January or February. A couple weeks went by, and he's like, this isn't the time to vote on DACA. We need to wait a little bit longer. And, people, activists were adamant that Democrats should not trust him on that deal. And sure enough, they were right. Nothing happened. And I'm also reminded at the same time, there was this huge groundswell of activism throughout the Trump years on immigration that is totally absent. And that speaks to the outrage that you saw when you wrote your column in the Washington Post, Felipe. Simply pointing out that while there are differences between Biden and Trump, in some respects, this is just a continuation of the same old policies, maybe under a different name, maybe a slightly different aesthetic. But in effect, there are some policies that are very similar. People, I don't know what it is. They just refuse to accept that this is the case, and it's deeply unfortunate. And with the negotiations then on the fiscal cliff in DACA to now, they're going to keep shifting right no matter what. And especially on this issue, because they see it as such an effective wedge issue. And we need people to understand. We need people in Congress. We need people at large, especially in the Democratic base, to understand they aren't going to negotiate in good faith, especially on an issue like this, because they see it as such an effective wedge issue.
I think what you're outlining is the total vapidity of this kind of approach to creating policy like this. I think the Obama administration is the perfect example of that. Not just around issues of immigration. This is what we're talking about, but I think in general, like at this style of doing politics where, Obama like expands this massive deportation machine, right? And deports more people than any president in American history, because the elites in the Democratic Party kind of have this idea that this is going to give us this credibility. So the right now, when we negotiate with them, they know that we're serious about this issue, and we're deporting everybody. We're deporting absolutely everyone we can possibly think of. We're ensuring that this like incredibly cruel machine is still functioning at high capacity. And then that will give us this kind of like cachet when we negotiate. So we can negotiate with Republicans to pass a bipartisan deal that protects, the good immigrants, the dreamers, and the people that have that have done nothing wrong, and protect them. And it just shows how, like you're pointing out, there's nothing that any liberal or Democrat can ever actually do to get conservatives to negotiate with them in good faith on this. And you saw that completely blow up in their face. And you're seeing the same situation now. And it's like, yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it too. It's like, you got to wonder, is this just what they believe in doing? Are they just getting outworked, or, is the other side doing politics better than them? Or do they just believe in this, but they want to maybe put a slightly more progressive sheen on this, like, incredibly cruel and barbaric immigration machine that whatever party the president is a part of, they're ultimately in charge of.
I think what's going on right now is also a really good caution against kind of valorizing one group of immigrants over another, or kind of like accepting this premise that like there is a group of quote unquote criminal aliens, and then there's also a different distinct group of people who are worthy of humanitarian protection, whether they be dreamers or what have you. Because like, I mean, if you look at it objectively, like the people who are arriving at the border are fleeing horrible, horrible circumstances. If you talk to them, their situations are like incredibly sympathetic. Like in a different political environment, they would be like the kind of like poster children for like what the Democratic Party would want to be doing at the border. I mean, under Trump, they were families, they were babies, they were like people who were fleeing very horrible circumstances who we have vowed to protect and are bound to protect under both domestic and international law. And now under Biden, suddenly those sympathetic circumstances don't matter or don't register or no longer exist, even though in a lot of countries, because of COVID and because of the global economy, things have only gotten worse. And I think that maybe it didn't start with the DREAM Act, but like this idea of like selecting one group of immigrants or of non-citizens and saying, well, they're especially deserving of humanitarian protection because of how virtuous they are, allows for people who want immigration restriction to then kind of like turn that on its head and make any asylum seeker, for example, a potential drug smuggler or a potential criminal, or how they're always talking about prayer rugs at the border and how ISIS is coming, and how they're taking advantage of how open the border is to like infiltrate the United States.
I must say too, there seems to be a pretty big discrepancy between you're talking about how this kind of like humanitarian immigration system and people that are applying for asylum are not really treated as being eligible, even if they meet these criterias. And the way this kind of massive bureaucracy is used as an excuse, it's so unwieldy and there's so many people and it's just not possible. Even if we want to, it's just not possible to bring in all these people that are claiming asylum. Strangely, weirdly, over the last year and a half, it was actually no problem for hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian immigrants to get resettled all across America. And the system somehow managed to find a way to accommodate all these people. And to be clear, people that are fleeing war zones should be able to get resettled in America or Canada or claim refugee status. But it is pretty interesting the way these excuses are thrown around about why it's just totally impossible to bring in these asylum seekers on the southern border because of this vast kind of labyrinthine bureaucratic system. But when it comes to Ukrainian immigrants fleeing war there, it seems like this system is able to accommodate them just fine. And you got to wonder what the difference is between these two groups of immigrants and why one group is allowed to immigrate and not be subjected to these same kinds of practices, and why one group is just constantly held in this bureaucratic limbo. Kind of interesting.
We can't forget, right, that sort of all of the kind of like minutiae of the policy aside, the person, the sort of mastermind of all this is Miller, who is basically a white, a great replacement guy, right? Who, really kind of an adherent to the idea that, the sort of the traditional American population is being replaced, either by sinister forces or just by inertia and incompetence or whatever, right? And that something needs to be done about this. And this is kind of an animating philosophy of his. In fact, now he's out of the White House, and of course he's got his own sort of law institute, and he's trying to sort of sue on behalf of people who've been discriminated against for being white and all this sort of stuff. And so, we can't separate that from the way that the policy was tailored, just like we haven't been able to separate kind of the issue of kind of race and more broadly, like who is an undesirable and who's a sort of a desirable from the entire history of, U.S. immigration policy dating back to the first ever laws. I mean, one of the first kind of major federal law, there was a Citizenship Act of 1870, but then sort of the first kind of actual federal U.S. law that controlled who could actually enter the country was the Chinese Exclusion Act. Which, I mean, is right there in the name, right? It was the founding kind of federal law of around immigration was about excluding a specific subset of people on account of their kind of national origin and race. And so, that's never been not part of the system, right? And it isn't not part of the system now. With the Ukrainians, there was a great mobilization. They were given a humanitarian parole in many of them, which allowed them to work immediately, which is something that still hasn't happened for the vast majority of kind of asylum seekers that are in the country. And they were actually rather infamously excluded from Title 42 expulsions pretty quickly after a few of them had been expelled. There was this big public outcry or whatever, and then they were basically categorically excluded while the people kept being expelled. And I mean, if you look at the Afghans, for example, the United States had a very direct involvement in Afghanistan, as direct as you can possibly have, an occupation. And we have basically thrown most of the sort of Afghan allies to the wolves here, right? We even have a special immigrant visa only for sort of Afghan and Iraqi interpreters and people who aided in the war effort. And, a lot of those visas were issued, but there are a lot of parole applications for people who either didn't qualify or who weren't processed fast enough before the kind of collapse of Kabul that have been denied or have gone unfilled. And so, we weren't able to move heaven and earth for the Afghans. You can point to kind of these discrepancies throughout history, right? I mean, you look at even during the 80s and 90s, right? The asylum rate for Cubans, for example, fleeing Cuba was almost 100%, maybe not quite 100%, but functionally 100%. Whereas, and for the USSR as well, whereas, asylum grant rates for people from El Salvador and Nicaragua and stuff were abysmal. I mean, El Salvador, I think, had a 3% grant rate for several of the years where they were in a literal civil war, except that, the people who were fleeing oftentimes were fleeing the right-wing military government that the U.S. was actively supporting. And so, these things have never been, separate from these types of considerations about, the politics of who gets to come in and why and all these sorts of things. I said something about, oh yeah. So, and also I think the Biden administration is kind of terrified to be seen as sort of extending a hand to kind of the asylum seekers, even when they're kind of already here. And so part of this whole kind of sentiment of chaos that has evolved from all of the busing and all of the people that are kind of, being accommodated in New York and elsewhere is that, once they're kind of have entered, and if they haven't been subjected to Title 42 or whatever, the government is basically going completely hands off, right? I mean, FEMA is giving, a few $100 million to cities that are affected, but the U.S., the federal government has an enormous infrastructure that could be mobilized to actually help these people arrive and integrate fully. ICE has a fleet of planes that they contract for deportations that they could use for kind of moving people around the country, and there's a whole refugee resettlement infrastructure that basically is in place, but which we're not really tapping into for sort of asylum seekers. And so part of that also, I think, is that they really don't want to be seen as creating a draw for people to actually come. And I mean, this isn't earth-shattering stuff. We had Kamala Harris going to Guatemala and saying, "Don't come." My message to you is "Don't come," or whatever it is. She said it was something along those lines. And so, I think that again, with the whole kind of crisis thing, it also is kind of self-inflicted. I mean, this could have been handled a different way. It could be handled a different way now, but it isn't, right? We won't actually mobilize in the way that we could for these populations.
And these are countries that are very close to us. They are geographically our neighbors. Whereas Ukraine is very, very far away. Ukrainians are much more likely to want to resettle somewhere in Europe. So you have to ask yourself, I mean, why the number of Cuban and Haitian, Venezuelan, and Nicaraguans is so much lower than the number of Ukrainians. And I mean, the hurdles or the barriers to like even getting this, you have to have a US sponsor. They have to like pledge to be financially responsible for you. If you can't be financially responsible for yourself, you have to have a valid passport. There are all of these things that the administration can point to be like, oh, see, we are expanding humanitarian migration. But unlike asylum, this doesn't get you citizenship. After 2 years, like, you could be out.
Felipe and Gaby, thank you so much for helping break this down and helping us understand what's going on. We encourage people to check out and subscribe to Borderlines so you can continue to get the best and most concise information on the immigration front. Aside from Borderlines, where can people find you both and follow your work?
All right, so I'm on Twitter still for the time being, to be seen, but it is a hard addiction to break. But so it's Felipe DLH, so FELIPE DLH. I'm also a member of the New York Daily News editorial board, so you can sort of check out our editorials, which I will caveat as saying that they're, of course, not exclusively my opinion. They are our consensus opinion. So, don't rake me over the coals, but, it's, you can go check me out there as well. And then I write for a variety of other, kind of publications. I've written a good amount for The Intercept, The New Republic, The Baffler every once in a while, more kind of essay type things, and a bunch of other outlets.
I'm on Twitter at Gaby DVJ. That's Gaby, Gaby, 1B, not 2, DVJ. I write for a couple different publications. I've written for The Verge, The Baffler, The Drift, The Nation. Yeah, thank you guys so much for having us.
Pleasure to have you.
Thanks all.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to The Insurgents. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can find us on iTunes or Spotify or at Substack, theinsurgents.substack.com. You'll get the latest episodes delivered straight to your inbox as well as our newsletter. On Twitter, we are at InsurgentsPod. Tweet at us, harass Ken in our replies, and then send us your hate mail to theinsurgentspod@gmail.com. Thank you once again for listening.